Good morning. This is another little fragment from the novel that I'm writing. I'm not quite sure where in the story this one goes, but it's a little bit of a backstory just to bring us up to speed. You may remember this is set in a near future world in which antinatalist policies and philosophies are generally adopted. So it's the last generation. As I say, I'm not quite sure where this bit fits yet, but we'll see. Okay. The old were usually poor. Since the introduction of the Imposition Compensation Bill, which made it possible for children to sue their parents for the act of non-consensual life that had been visited upon them, old people were usually left with nothing, spending their last days destitute and in state-run care centres. This simple bringing onto the statute books of a means of seeking recompense for crimes committed against the self made a huge difference to the birth rate. From the day when that first case was successfully prosecuted and the young man in South America secured a financial settlement from his parents that would cripple them financially for the rest of their lives, things changed. The setting of this precedent sent a shockwave through the natalist community, who suddenly realized that the actions they were taking could have a significant and lasting impact not only on their progeny but also on themselves. Up until this moment it was enshrined in law that when a child reached maturity at the age of 18 or at 21, they were no longer the responsibility of those individuals who had birthed them. Conveniently, children under the age of 18 who realized the dreadful crime that had been committed against them were rare, so by the time they were old enough, it was too late, and the statute of limitations allowed parents to avoid culpability. It was an embarrassment to jurisprudence, and the overturning of this immoral tradition was long overdue. Within the first 12 months of the bill being on the books, over 500,000 people took their parents to the courts in order to seek compensation for the life they had been forced to endure. And it was not just those who had experienced sad or unhappy lives who were eligible. Imposition affected everyone, and the most privileged, cosseted and protected children had been deprived of non-existence every bit as much as the abused, the starving and the destitute. In fact, as was successfully argued in a landmark case brought by the daughter of Paris Hilton, those individuals who had the least suffering in this world, who gained the most material wealth, were endowed with the strongest and most attractive physical bodies, were showered with love and attention. These were actually the ones who had been imposed upon them most. Their affluent lives, in which their every desire was indulged and their every want fulfilled, were most obviously the diametrical opposite to the state of absence they had been in before. They were unwillingly brought into existence. As non-beings, they had nothing and no one. The void from which they had been wrenched contained none of the wealth and fame and power that had been foisted upon them during their lives here, in the affluent hell of prison planet Earth. How they longed to be back there, where they had wanted for nothing and received nothing. Here they wanted for everything, and it was given. Mountains of objects were heaped upon them. Cars, houses, jewellery, electronic gadgets and gizmos, yachts, gowns, the whole kit and caboodle. And the more they desired, the more they received. An endless tide of possessions and a ceaseless round of hedonism and delight. This was the worst kind of torment, so much worse than being born poor. At least those born into poverty still felt some connection to the pure nothing from which they had been birthed. In their fortunate avoidance of wealth and status, they were closer to the absence of being that all the living longed for. Those individuals who were born to underclass parents on sinkhole council estates were the lucky ones. They were not cursed with the feeling of being important that the moneyed aristocracy had to bear. The plebs and proles and chavs knew from the outset that their lives had no purpose or meaning, and they had no way of actually making a difference in the world. In this, they continued to embody the pointlessness and meaninglessness of the universe itself, a reality that only the non-existent really knew, but at least the poor could glimpse it. The rich and famous had it tough. And it wasn't just material wealth and power that made life for the 1% such an intolerable burden. They were also usually laden with the additional baggage of rude good health. Their bodies had been formed inside the stomachs of well-fed, educated women, and had been pulled into the world by the best obstetricians that money could buy. As babies they had been vaccinated against all known diseases, and at the slightest sniffle they had been attended by highly trained doctors and consultants. They had spent their unfortunate childhoods in airy, sunlit environments where their bodies could grow strong, and they had been given the best food and the most protective housing. Their minds had been stimulated through world-class education, and entertainment had constantly been available to ensure that no moments of ennui clouded their youth. Compare the lives of these sad, privileged children to the childhood of those fortunate enough to be born in less salubrious circumstances. In ghettos and shanty towns, there were babies being born who would be eaten by rats within hours of their birth. How lucky they were! Others were coming out of the darkness of non-existence into lives that were mercifully cut short by polio, AIDS and dysentery. Some were lucky enough to have birth defects or congenital deformities and would never feel imposed upon by the love of others. Many would be poor and would never acquire the wealth of possessions that would so distance them from the nothing they had when they themselves were nothing. Being born was bad, but being born rich, healthy, attractive and powerful was an atrocity of unbelievable proportions. This was a crime for which someone had to pay, and pay handsomely. And pay they did. Paris Hilton had been successfully sued by her daughter for the imposition of a horribly successful life, and as a result had lost everything, so ended her days in a state-run geriatric hospital with inadequate facilities and no heating. The staff in the hospital were criminals doing community service, and none had proper medical training. Many took the opportunity to sexually abuse the patients, and nobody cared. Finally, after no one had attended to her for several days, she breathed her last in that filthy hospital bed, soiled with her own excrement, her silicone-enhanced breasts still pert amongst the sallow, wrinkled flesh of her failing body. Basically, she got what was coming to her. Okay, so that's I'm not quite sure where that section goes, but yes, any comments or feedback, always welcome. Thanks very much. Bye.